Good afternoon. It's great to see everyone here today. My name is Tom Wright. I'm Director of the Centre on the United States and Europe here at the Brookings Institution. It is a great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon for a discussion on the legacy of 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the end of the Cold War. This past weekend, as everyone here knows, marked the 30th anniversary of the accidental opening of the Berlin Wall. On November 9, 1989, following a confused press conference, East Germans rushed the Berlin Wall and more than 140 of their fellow citizens had died trying to cross and demanded they be allowed through. The 30 years since that night have been marked by incredible progress toward this goal, but also immense challenges remain as the European order is deeply challenged from both within and from without. Today's discussion will not only focus on the legacy of these events, but it will also seek to determine what this legacy means for the next 30 years of transatlantic relations. We are fortunate to welcome such a talented group of Brookings scholars to the stage to discuss their takeaways from this momentous event. Jim Goldgar is the Robert Bosch Senior Visiting Fellow at Brookings and one of the most foremost experts on the subject of NATO and U.S. policy toward Russia since the end of the Cold War. Victoria Newland is a non-resident Senior Fellow at Brookings and also a Senior Counselor at the Albright-Stonebridge Group. She served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs from 2013 to 2017, and she was a key architect of President Obama's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. My colleague Constanza Stelschenmuller is a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. Slightly out of date by a week there, but and an expert in Germany and transatlantic relations. She is currently on leave at the Library of Congress to write a book. And she has also just written a fantastic essay on her personal reflections on 1989, which I highly recommend to everyone and which we'll discuss here on the panel in a moment. And you can download that from the Brookings website. And finally, we're delighted to welcome Susan Glasser of The New Yorker to Brookings to moderate the discussion. Susan is the author of the book Kremlin Rising from her time as a correspondent in Moscow, and also is the author of a forthcoming book next summer on James Baker. Few people have the depth of experience and perspective to tackle this issue like Susan, so thank you for joining us today. In putting together this event, we are thankful for the support of the Robert Bosch Stiftung. This event is part of the Brookings Bosch Transatlantic Initiative, or BBTI as we call it, which aims to expand our networks and work on how best to further transatlantic cooperation to address global challenges. So now, to leave plenty of time for conversation, I will also join the panel. I'd like to ask the panelists up here and Susan to begin the moderation. Thank you.
All right. Well, Tom, thank you so much for that good introduction. We're going to embarrass Constanza more by shamelessly flacking more for her essay called German Lessons, which I do highly recommend as well. But I think it's also, it's a great starting point for any conversation to think that it's been 30 years. Clearly, we're all too young for that to have been the case.
Absolutely.
Let's just stipulate that.
Exactly.
Nursery school was very big on the fall of the wall. But when I think about, the range of foreign policy challenges, you quote Timothy Garton-Ash in this essay, Constanza, talking about this night of wonders. In many ways, it was a year of wonders, and then some, a year and change of wonders. One that it's hard even to convey to a new generation who has spent the last decade plus, immersed in a constant drumbeat of what appears to be, revanchism and bad news, to convey what it was like to grow up or to be in a university setting, graduating, moving into the world at this moment of great optimism. That's a lifetime foundational event that I almost feel like even that itself is worthy of a whole conversation. So I thought, I was recently discussing this 1989 Year of Wonders with someone who said to me, it was probably the best year of our lives. We just didn't know it at the time. And so I thought we might as well start out, with a sort of foundational moment, question about that, because we all carry those assumptions and those experiences of 30 years ago with us, I think, as we're talking about the unbelievable challenges, not only in Europe today, but also in the United States in terms of how we even think about Europe 30 years after the end of the Cold War. Costanza, we know what you were doing on that night, courtesy of your essay. I don't want to spoil it, but it turned out you and I were in the same place, although we did not know each other.
Well, yeah. Can I just first make an acknowledgement? I am here because of the really excellent quality of the double-layered thermal underwear of a very well-known New England brand, without which I would not have survived 3 Massachusetts winters. I did get pneumonia at least once, but I made it through. But yes, that is exactly where I was. I was going to graduate school. And really thinking that I didn't want to go back to Europe. I had left a Germany that I thought, and a Europe that I thought was hidebound, depressed. I thought the political atmosphere was polarized, was leaden. We were the second largest generational cohort to come on the labor market. We couldn't explain to our parents, who had been sucked up by the labor market in the late 50s and early 60s, that it would be very hard for us to find a job no matter how good we were. And a lot of us had fled to other countries to go to graduate school. And certainly those of us who'd gone to America thought, we're totally staying here. And this whole baggage of, European depression, the end of growth, the end of sort of the upward mobility, we want to get rid of that. And in fact, some of my age cohort did do that. But as I wrote in this essay, I was completely caught off guard by the wall coming down. Of course, I had, because I had been flying back and forth to Europe because of an illness of my mother's, I had grasped the importance of what was happening in Poland and the Czech Republic. But I think all of us thought the East Germans, were going to stay there forever because the East Germans had always been the best communists in the entire Soviet bloc. And even the Soviets thought that. If you look at Mary-Elise Serrati's book, about the collapse, historian who's now at SAIS, she interviewed a number of the people who were actors at the time, and there is a Soviet policymaker from the Kremlin who went to East Berlin to talk to the Honecker government. I've forgotten his name. And who came back saying, these guys are geriatric, they're so rigid, it's impossible to talk to them. And frankly, they were insulting to me. We're just, they're going to have to deal with this. And guess what? Guess what? It happened after all.
Yeah. One thing I was struck by was the extent to which, for you, it really was even almost a question of an identity that you weren't ready to take up in some ways as a German. You said, your gaze was not eastward into East Germany. That in some ways it was as far away for you as Arkhangelsk or Siberia.
Yeah. Well, the part of that was generational and part of it was personal. The generational thing was that for many of us, we had literally grown up with the wall. I was the same age as the wall. And while the official policy of West Germany was to not relinquish the notion of eventual reunification, de facto, what we were doing was rapprochement with East Berlin. And Ostpolitik was a very careful balancing of our membership in NATO and finding a modus vivendi with the East Germans and with the other Eastern Europeans. And frankly, the assumption was this was going to be there forever. It would never change. And then in my personal case, I had no family on the other side of the wall, unlike others that I knew. I was going to a really conservative, hidebound law school in Bonn, the capital, at the time, and some of the guys from families whose fathers were politicians in the CDU who were revanchist and who would give speeches in the Bundestag saying we want parts of Poland back, and I wanted no part of that, and so I kept a long distance from these guys. And also, of course, my law school teachers were the star students of men who had been deeply implicated as jurists during the Third Reich in the maintenance and the building of the Third Reich and its killing apparatus. And I found that to be profoundly offensive. And I remember, actually, I went home my first Christmas. And the other thing, I was a foreign service brat, so my parents were outside the country. And I went home my first Christmas to Madrid crying and saying, listen, this is all too horrible. I want none of the historical baggage. And also, they're all really right-wing. And you know, the ones who aren't are always in the streets protesting against the Pershings, and it's horrible. And my parents said, you know, sorry, we don't have the money to send you to America or to England. If you don't like it, go back and change it. Yeah, but, and I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to America, and I thought, this is my escape. I am never going back to this. This is all too awful.
Yeah, so it sort of gave you Germany back in a way that, you know, you couldn't have anticipated at that moment.
Yeah,
and yet, Tura, I want to come to you because this expectation that, you know, that even Constanza had of somehow we knew it was both unsustainable and yet we kind of felt like it would go on forever. That was kind of the Cold War. You were just starting out as a in the Foreign Service as a young Soviet expert at this time.
Absolutely. So I come into the Foreign Service in late 1984, speaking Russian. So the Foreign Service, in its wisdom, sent me to China.
As they do.
And it took me, you know, 5 years to make my way back into the Soviet business. And so I was on the Soviet desk, 1988, 89, an amazing Soviet desk, in fact, as we go back and think about it. Sandy Vershbow was the director, John Teft was the deputy director, Steve Pfeiffer was the external chief, and John Herbst was my boss in the economic section.
All names, if you've had anything to do with Russia over the last 2 decades, you've run into all of those people.
Yep. All went on to be distinguished ambassadors in probably a total of 10 countries and shapers of the post-Cold War response, I would say, and mentors.
And so did you.
Well, thank you.
But there was the
But interestingly, you know, our response was a little bit different because the summer before that, I had spent, you know, we obviously were watching the Balts rebel. We were watching what was happening in student movements. I'd written my thesis on solidarity, which to me felt like the beginning already back in 1979. So there was this maybe naive, youthful hope that we would live through a period where there would be an opportunity to have a real relationship with all of these countries, and particularly for somebody like me who'd gone to university and fallen in love with Russian language and culture and wanted to have the opportunity to build a better world together and not have this hidebound system between us. So on our Soviet desk, which was, again, 88, we were working with Bob Zellick, who had the portfolio to work with Gorbachev on perestroika and to see if we could support this economic opening. Now, what we thought was going to happen was that, you know, you would, like folks who opposed the embargo to Cuba, that somehow if you did more trade, that lifestyle would begin to change politics and that the economics would be the driver. We didn't imagine that politics would be the driver. But on the other side of the desk, we were also doing a huge amount of arms control then. It was the, you know, completion of the Reagan mandate and the CFE treaty and all those kinds of things. So there was a sense of real promise with the Soviet Union even at that time. But more importantly for me personally, I had been on the first team to open our new embassy in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia in the 9 months before that, so before I got to the Soviet desk in 88. And the experience we had there, you know, none of us knew the country, none of us knew much about it, so we sort of did that first political and economic mapping. We were an embassy of 2. I was the junior member of the team. I was the political officer, the economic officer, the cultural officer, the defense attaché, and the junior GSO. But the way we worked it, my boss at the time, Steve Mann, was talking to all the leaders, and I was talking to all the young assistants to the leaders. And those younger folk were beginning to say, we want what is stirring in Central Europe. We want change. These guys are giving us nothing. and we're going to fight for it as soon as we get the chance. So you could feel in our generation already this incredible hunger. Yeah.
That's a great story. And so just on the question of Germany, though, and the fall of the wall, you mentioned Zellick. He would keep, for months afterwards, after the fall of the wall, he famously kept a memo from the European Bureau that you would go on to head many years later, saying basically everybody wants reunification and nobody thinks it will happen in our lifetime. That it was not something that expert sentiment, had called.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first question was whether Germans actually wanted it, which comes up quite clearly in your essay, Constanza, where you've sort of been looking at each other warily. There's a lot of complex politics and history, generation to generation. So I think we didn't assume that it would happen anywhere near as quickly, but of course, being who we are, or perhaps who we were, the minute the Germans themselves said, we think we can do this, we want to do this, we wanted to be the major support, and as is well known, it was not an easy decision for the UK and France to support, so I think we were important to that conversation, but the German people and the German leadership on both sides were the essential factor.
That said, I think we have to acknowledge in retrospect that none of us had any idea what we were taking on.
Yes.
I mean, Helmut Kohl, then the Chancellor, famously said, we will have blühende Landschaften, blooming landscapes in eastern Germany, and it won't cost us a penny. And if I were still paying taxes in Germany, which I don't because I live here, but I would still be paying the so-called solidarity tax. And in the end, it has been a huge effort on all sides. And arguably, what we're seeing now in both the economic, the demographic, and the political data coming out of Germany and Eastern Germany and the regional elections there shows us that this is still very much an ongoing effort, and that we're still excavating problems. In fact, in many ways, there is now literature about the economics of reunification or about the politics that literally took, I think, 3 generations to tackle. Yeah. I mean, there's this one young East German author called Christian Bangel who's written a very moving piece called The Baseball Bat Years, Die Baseballschlägerjahre, where he writes about the endemic violence in the villages and in the cities of East Germany, where suddenly the caretaker state had retreated, and all hell had broken loose, and people are now trying to understand why that happened and why it's still feeding into electoral politics to this day. And I remember, as I wrote in the essay, very vividly as a junior reporter at a daily in Berlin called Tagesspiegel, being sent to cover a neo-Nazi thug trial, and seeing these young neo-Nazis sort of lolling around in front of the judge and the prosecutor and thinking, wow, they're clearly trying to prove that they're unimpressed. And then afterwards, I head out with my notes to phone into the paper, and I see sort of these busloads of guys converging from both sides with baseball bats and proceed to chase each other around the courthouse. Beating each other up.
Essentially, the outbreak of politics that neither side really, had any framework for thinking about
exactly,
because it was so new.
And which we ignored and denied for
well, it's interesting. It's almost like, to me, that scene you're describing is actually very similar to something I experienced in the southern Iraq city of Basra in the 48 hours after the departure of the Saddam regime. Something very similar, which was that there were thousands of people in the streets in protest marches, and you realized these underground political factions had immediately, come to the surface. This group was allied with this group in Iran, this group. And I think probably the U.S. government had basically no idea about this eruption, this volcano of suppressed political activity that would come to shape this place in ways we barely understood. That and the former Ba'athist generals that were sitting at home doing nothing, beginning to plan the resistance. Jim, how much do you think the incredible, heady, but also disorienting experience of 1989 to 91. How much did it shape, this current generation of American foreign policy thinking? I mean, this was, how much did we embrace a narrative at that moment and a series of choices that we're still living with right now? Was that your perspective, that was this foundational moment? Or did you think history was over and you made a disastrous career choice?
Well, I mean, I actually in the fall of '89 was on the academic job market for the first time. I was finishing my dissertation, and right about the time the wall fell, I did actually get a job at Cornell University to teach Soviet foreign policy. I started there in January of '91. I taught it for a year. That class moved over to the history department, and I moved on to other things. But I think the power of that moment for American policymakers really came through the pro-American, pro-Western sentiment that was, clearly there across Central and Eastern Europe. The desire to be part of the West, the desire to, have what America had, and I think that proved incredibly important in the early 2000s. You mentioned Iraq. A lot of the people who were in the government during the time of '89 to '91 and saw the reaction from Central and Eastern Europeans were in the government in 2003 thinking that, the Americans would be greeted as liberators in Iraq and that we would repeat the story there that we saw in Central and Eastern Europe. And all you need to do is let people be free, and they pull down the statues, and they want to be part of what we've got. And it's just you started your remarks today by just noting the incredible optimism of the time and the optimism about what people thought of us, which, as you mentioned at the outset, for a younger generation would seem rather perplexing today.
That's right. Well, in fact, my own experience of that night in Berlin was I was doing what college students do, and I took a nap, which one does in college, and woke up 2 hours later to see a security guard at the front door of our dorm with a small TV that had suddenly materialized on his desk. This was not a guy with a TV normally. He was just shouting over and over, oh my God, what is it? And this palpable sense, once I figured out that, World War III hadn't broken out, that, when do you go to sleep in one world and wake up in another world? It's just not an experience. But of course, Tom, we could have had an alternate narrative of 1989, which was the story of Tiananmen Square and the rejection of democracy, which arguably is one of the grand stories of the time, the Chinese choice from that same year. And yet, clearly here in Washington, in the U.S., we embraced a different narrative. For us, it will always be the first month of the Arab Spring, that moment in time.
Well, without skipping too far ahead in our conversation, there was one man, as you know, an American, who looked at what happened at the fall of the wall and sort of regretted it and would later say that it was a shame that the Russians did not respond like China did in Tiananmen Square, and he is President of the United States today. So there wasn't a uniform
Tom, you had to bring
welcoming, but I can't possibly resist.
No, it wasn't me. It wasn't me.
But no, you're right. Bar that one person, I think Americans did see this as a very positive development. And of course, the Soviets weren't willing to pay the cost in blood that it would have taken to put that down. I think that is not something that we can take for granted when we look today at around the world where there still are sort of authoritarian regimes. Most of those regimes, I think, would behave in a very different way if they were challenged. And what it shows, I think, is that it's really partially the mindset of those dictators or autocrats and how they would sort of respond. And while obviously that was a very evil regime, I think the choices that they made at that time were very significant. And I think, when we look back on it, and there's a lot of discussion now about whether or not that legacy has been frittered away or whether or not it has been somewhat of a disappointment, I think we got a very good sort of long period of time, 30 years, 25 years, by historical standards is a very long sort of era, and to have been guaranteed that level of sort of democracy, peace and prosperity in Europe up until, I guess, around 2014 or so, if not nothing. So I think as we look at the challenges today and all of the problems, I don't see that as sort of a repudiation in a way of the legacy of 1989. That's just, the way history evolves. We'll always have new challenges, and problems. But I think they would have been, and this gets to some of Jim's work, but I think, had different choices been made by the United States and by Germany and others after the fall of the wall, and those problems would have probably been much worse. Like, I think actually, for the most part, the policymakers did really well on consolidating the gains from that pretty amazing moment.
It's very interesting, actually, because if you go back and, read it all into that time, as I'm sure was interesting for you, Constanza, working on this essay, the big debate was not Russia, which is our conversation, and I'm sure we'll shift to that now, and how it would feel about the reunification of Germany and the collapse of the wall. But it was really, are we going to somehow unintentionally set ourselves up for the return of the German question, having been the dominant theme of European security debates over the previous century and a half. And in fact, it was, Toria, you mentioned it was the British, Margaret Thatcher, and the French who were the most concerned about a fast unification of Germany at this time. And, I'm curious, Constanza, did you find, or, as you've sort of excavated that period, to what extent do you think the questions about Russia were answerable? It's like, Putin has a narrative about this moment that has become foundational for him and his grievance. What is your view about, whether that was even a relevant discussion at the moment? I mean, obviously the Soviet Union still existed in November of 1989, but it was also clear that it was in dire straits.
Right. Well, obviously the German question is my favorite question. I could, all of us Germans ask ourselves that, and we're going to ask ourselves that for the rest of our lives, I think. But I think at the time it was in these sort of heady triumphalist days and months and years after reunification, the idea was this is a problem that we've solved. Basically, what had become apparent in the negotiations with Gorbachev and the Kremlin was just how decrepit the Soviet system was. And part of that was negotiating with the price for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Eastern Germany. We paid the Russians billions, I think, to move them all back and basically to construct housing for them back in the Soviet Union. And then took over the empty bases. And it became clear that these poor people had lived there under really miserable, impoverished conditions. And that gave us, as it were, a tangible insight into just how decrepit the whole system was. And so I think the policymakers of the time can probably be forgiven for thinking, they are going to spend the next decade, resolving their own issues, and maybe they will come our way, hopefully. Yeah, and with somebody like Gorbachev, who was much more amenable to reasonable conversation than the geriatric regime of the GDR. And keep in mind, one of the last minister-president of the GDR is still alive, Egon Krenz, and some of the German press has been going and interviewing him and portraying him. And he has clearly learned absolutely zip. He's about, I think he's 83 now. He was in his 50s at the time. And one of my favorite quote from one of these recent interviews is, well, nobody complained about East German prisons before 1989. Well, no. Because something much worse would have happened to them. I find this astounding. But
how has he spent his 30 years?
I think he's probably, there is still the matter of the shall we say, not inconsiderable financial assets of the GDR regime, which has not been resolved. And I suspect that, I don't know, there must be funding somewhere. I'm going to put that very carefully because I don't actually have sources for this. But this is one of the unresolved questions post 1989 of the dissolution of the GDR. So in some ways the Soviets appeared to be younger, more willing to accept change, more willing to change themselves. And remember that what Gorbachev was doing was truly extraordinary. If you had, like me, grown up with geriatric old fogies like Chernenko and Andropov, I mean, Gorbachev was a miracle of reasonableness and youthful energy. Yeah, and certainly compared to Erich Honecker, who at that time was more or less, I think, on his way into dementia. And Egon Krenz, his successor, the guy I've just quoted, was, just so much more provincial and hidebound, than certainly Gorbachev or Raisa Gorbacheva, who made a furore wherever she went, including with the Reagans. Yes. But by the way, I do want to make one point, which I just I have yet to read it up. But on this weekend, I was sitting at a dinner with Phil Zelikow and a bunch of other people who made policy in the day. And Phil has just written another book. He was the director for Europe policy in the White House at the time, and was instrumental in the negotiation of the 2+4 agreement, which led to German reunification and full sovereignty. And Phil has been going through the archives and said something which I did not know, which is that Reagan had a second conversation after his famous speech in Berlin in 1987. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He had a later conversation with Gorbachev in which he told him, that maybe taking down the wall hadn't been such a great idea after all. So and Phil found that in the files. Again, I have to read that up. But that is to say that we genuinely benefited from a moment where everything came together and everybody decided to be enlightened, which is why in my essay I say this is a moment of amazing grace, which, was a deliberate theological reference because amazing grace, and I'm a Lutheran, is something that sort of comes to you from above and you haven't really done anything to deserve it, but you go run with it.
So, Jim and Toria, I want to bring you guys in then on exactly this question of, did we do something right? Did we screw something up? Were we just lucky? George H.W. Bush famously is, shown the first TV pictures of the fall of the wall, and they bring the TV in and they bring the press pool into the Oval Office because they recognize it's a historic moment. And I believe it's Leslie Stahl says to him, Mr. President, what do you think of this? And he says, well, I don't want to dance on the wall, don't want to be too triumphant. No victory dance here. And he got a lot of trouble for that, for days, in fact. They were wondering, does he not process human emotion? Does he, but it's a good question. Restraint, in effect, was the American policy at this moment. And yet, at the same time, in the 10 months of negotiations that followed, they were very firm on the idea that Germany was going to be in NATO. Sorry guys, but that's really how it's going to work out. And that was an unyielding American goal. There was a lot of questions which Putin has raised about Jim Baker and whether he promised them not to move 1 inch eastward. But I'm curious.
What does Jim Baker say about that, by the way, having spent a lot of time with him in recent months?
You'll have to read our book, is the
Okay.
long answer. The short answer, though, is, look, there was no agreement with the Soviets about this. This was not the American negotiating position. And of course, both the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union were still in existence at this moment of time. So to contemplate a future without the Warsaw Pact on Germany's borders was not the world in which this negotiation was taking place. Have I represented that correctly? But I want to ask both of you. So tell us I'm just a college student. I'm watching this historic moment on TV, and I'm thinking freedom. You guys are much savvier. You're looking at this, and is NATO the first word that popped into your heads? How is it that became the West's predominant policy response to this?
So I think it's really important to understand for people like George H.W. and those around him, and this would be true again in the Clinton administration that followed, the lesson of the 20th century for those American policymakers was very, very clear, which in its most simple form, post-1919 bad, post-1945 good. In other words, the United States left Europe at the end of the peace after World War I, and 2 decades later, there was another World War. And after 1945, the United States stayed engaged in Europe and helped a peaceful and prosperous Western Europe develop and thrive. And they really feared that if the U.S., under domestic pressure, were to leave Europe, that would create havoc in Europe. And there were a lot of Europeans who felt the same way, especially in the midst and the immediate aftermath of German unification. And I think they also saw this as an enormous opportunity. Again, Central Europe as the origin of 2 world wars and a Cold War, the opportunity after the end of the Cold War. George H.W. Bush had talked about a Europe whole and free when he gave a speech in West Germany in May of 1989. It's sort of this opportunity. Oh my gosh, we now have this opportunity to fix this darn continent once and for all, and really try to create a more peaceful landscape, which provided the impetus for NATO's enlargement across Central and Eastern Europe, provided the impetus for American support for European Union enlargement across Central and Eastern Europe. And from the standpoint of that thinking, that was an enormous success. The problem was, how do you find a place for Russia in all of that? And that proved to be a lot more difficult than I think people recognized until much later.
I would just pick up from there and remind that the second big project that was going on the continent from, depends how you mark it, 86, 87, was Gorbachev's effort to transform the Soviet Union itself and to open the system, to make it more free, to start allowing public debate, to start allowing free enterprise, all of these things that seemed unthinkable themselves. And I think in the White House there was some concern that you didn't want to solve one problem and make it that much harder for Gorbachev. So I think for us, the first issue was, would Gorbachev tolerate all of Germany in NATO? And I think he was, frankly, so focused on saving his own nation, which, he obviously achieves on one front and doesn't achieve on another, given that what happens to the Soviet Union 2 years later. He was like, yeah, whatever. But also he understood the practicality almost before London and Paris, that you couldn't take half of Germany. And for us, you couldn't have a NATO without Germany, because it was the knitting of Germany in that was the purpose of NATO in the first place. So the physics and math of it didn't allow for any other option. The question was, how could you assure everybody that it wouldn't be a hostile NATO, that it would be a purely defensive NATO, and that it would actually give Gorbachev a little bit of time to withdraw his own troops quietly, which he knew he had to do because he couldn't afford it. And in fact, it was this bizarre boon to his restructuring of Soviet power that the German side paid for bringing all those folks back to the Soviet Union, because it wasn't obvious that Moscow was going to be able to pay for and do that. He ended up having to pay for pulling them all out of the Baltics and all of that, which was a strain on the budget at a time that they couldn't. So we were trying to balance a couple of things, and I think once Moscow said, yeah, we're focusing on our own garden, just keep supporting our reform, which we all thought would be gentle and take decades, it was a matter of walking and chewing gum at the same time.
Right. And go ahead, Constance.
Can I interject something here? I think I think you're both right to emphasize and praise the tremendous restraint that U.S. diplomacy practiced at the time, and I think there is a conversation where actually President Bush, or a minute of a conversation between Bush and Gorbachev, where Bush actually says, "You realize I was trying to do this so that you wouldn't get in trouble with all the, geriatric old ideologues back home," and Gorbachev says, "Yes, I noticed and I appreciated that."
Yes, although sorry.
But at the same time, what Russia also, what in the Yeltsin era, what Russia experienced and what Russian civil society experienced was a wholesale dismantling of what they had come to think of as a nasty, decrepit, but still a caretaker state, and a sort of capitalist free-for-all in which, among others, German banks, basically went for the fillet parts of the Russian economy. Yeah, and the sort of the animal was opened up and the hide was ripped off and everything was distributed. And I think that was the point when ordinary Russians began to think that this was somehow that the West was attempting to roll them, as it were.
Just two quick points. One, back on Bush's caution. I think when Bush's caution gets in the way is 2 years later, when there's the coup against Gorbachev, and Washington spends 22 hours trying to decide if it's going to be on the side of the coup plotters or on the side of Gorbachev. And I remember that distinctly because I was a baby political officer in Moscow counting, the 250,000 Russians standing in the rain defending their White House and defending Yeltsin, while my own government couldn't decide what side it was on. And that went to this fear of, sort of chaos and loose nukes and all of that. So that's the tough moment, I think. I was going to make another point but on the Russian side, I think there was, and we can get into this if you want to, there was a profound difference in the liberating, if you will, or the liberation of countries that had a historic memory of free markets, of open society, of being European, of being economically knitted in together, if not politically, like Germany, like Poland, versus countries that had been 70 years asleep with no political culture and a complete nanny state or kleptocratic state or whatever.
Sure.
And we treated them all the same, and
yes,
or they thought they could be the same as well.
And not just you, but we also. I mean, I think one of the problems in the past 25 years has been the European Union applying the same framing of transformation and a very onerous sort of body of rules and regulations that some states made huge sacrifices to as it were, absorb, like the Balts, who joined the euro in the middle of the global financial crisis when it was most painful for them at the cost of huge sort of austerity programs, basically as an added layer of political insurance against Russia. But the farther we got down, particularly when you look at the Romanian and Bulgarian accession in 2007, it was clear that these were very fragile political economies with a great deal of fragile civil societies, fragile institutions, and where arguably, I would say, this imposition of these whole ponderous EU body of rules was an additional burden. Yeah, rather than a stabilizing factor.
Well, I mean, Constance, you've brought us almost forward to today. Tom, Putin has said that essentially this period of time was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, the breakup of the Soviet Union, which, by the way, he experienced the very beginning of which in Germany at this moment of crisis when he is a young KGB officer in Dresden. And this is probably the most interesting moment in his as told to autobiography at the beginning of his political career. He describes the crowds, the protesting crowds surrounding the consulate and the KGB building where he was headquartered in Dresden. No one is there. He takes charge. He gets them to be burning their papers while they're frantically cabling back for orders. What should we do? And Moscow is silent. And this silence from Moscow seems to have been the defining moment for Putin's political career. He's made NATO his grievance. He's made it his narrative. Tom, do you think it still matters? I mean, it will, with the passing of the Cold War era of politicians, whether they be Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin or someone else, is this still even a conversation we need to be having about American foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think for Putin, as you point out, it is the driving sort of motivation. And, no one obviously knew about him at the time or throughout the 1990s, but that resentment built, and it was part of a broader resentment in Russia, and it was a coherent, constituency that ended up very much making its influence felt. And, when we look back on that, we can forget sometimes that Putin is still a relatively young man. Like, he can be there for, I think he's, 67, 68, so he could easily be in power for another, 10 or 15 years. And we can have all sorts of discussions on what Russia's national interest is and how much it should have a rapprochement with the West and be worried about China. But I think in many cases, it's Putin, not Russia, and his mindset is very firmly rooted in this period and what happened since. And I think that continues to define how Russia as a state thinks of its national interests. And I think as long as he's there, he will have this, really almost pathological distrust of the West. And I think the other part of it is that as we look back about why those ideas of democracy and liberty maybe faltered at some point and are now on the reverse in Europe and didn't take hold in Russia or in China, I think for people like Putin and also like Xi Jinping, they actually understood, I think, the power of those ideas and that they could take hold, and they determined to stop it, right? So they decided to proactively have sort of a Herculean effort to roll this back, Putin in Russia and in Europe, and of course Xi Jinping in a very different way in China. But they, I think, were worried about that march of those trends, that end of history, those ideas of convergence. They didn't think that those were empty, and it required an effort on the autocrats' part to push back. And I think that's what we're seeing. So we're seeing what Putin has always referred to as the snapback, I think very much still in motion. But I think it is, as you say, sort of rooted in his experience of that time.
Now, arguably, we have seen now 3 American presidents in a row who essentially have either withdrawn their gaze from Europe or, essentially taken a fairly dismissive view of the degree to which American national security any longer depends upon this. You obviously the form and the style is different between Obama and Trump, and yet there is that through line. The pivot to Asia, as I well recall, as does Toria, was not well taken in Berlin or other European capitals. Tom, do you think how would you describe American policy toward Germany and the heart of Europe right now? And aside from getting them to pay up, is there one?
Well, I think U.S. policy towards Europe is usually driven by the threats and challenges rather than by taking the region on its own terms and looking at sort of the opportunity and the importance of having what George Kennan sort of wrote about in that very early period, which is healthy regional orders in Western Europe and in Northeast Asia, right? There's been sort of this notion that it's not really about that, it's really about what Europe can do for us. And so when Europe, 10 years ago is not really a problem and it's not part of the solution, basically there's this disinvestment in terms of expertise, sort of a focus in Asia, a focus on the Middle East. And that, I think, is sort of natural and at the same time regrettable. But I do worry. Obviously, there's the Trump administration's policy through these ambassadors or some individuals in the administration, which is quite hostile. Even if one sets that aside as an anomaly, I do worry that the burden-sharing argument has totally distorted sort of the U.S. view of Europe, right? Because we're so fixated on this 2% number, and I do think Secretary Gates and President Obama deserve some blame on this too, that it's basically consumed everything else. And the real sort of, challenges are sort of going undiscussed. So it is a reality that Europe will bear more of the burden over time as the U.S. retrenches in the Middle East. They will have to cope with that regardless. But by focusing on this number rather than on how they will cope with that contagion of instability, I think we're missing something big. So I think that there has been, I think been distorted by that, but I think there is still, the sense by some, and including people on this sort of stage, that Europe as a healthy regional order just on its own is an important U.S. national interest. And if that is in trouble, then that will affect not just U.S. interests in Europe, but globally.
Toria, if you got a do-over, would you get rid?
On what, the 32 years?
Yeah, I don't know. No. But on Europe policy right now, I mean, would you say Tom is right, and let's not have this will? So let's not talk about 2%. Let's try to frame it differently. I mean, was there any moment in time where we could have avoided some of both the conflict with Russia and the bad feelings that clearly exist to a certain extent on both sides of the Atlantic?
Well, there's the Europe, as in EU, NATO Europe, and then there's the Russia question, and I think they're two different questions.
Yes.
I think there was a little bit of an exhaustion after the Balkan Wars, where there was a huge amount of effort, belated effort, but nonetheless, and a sense that the rest of the world had been neglected, and so, pivot was an unfortunate term. What we really wanted to say was to invest equally elsewhere, I think. But I also think that, in 2008, 9, 10, 11, an enormous amount of effort went into helping Europe come out of the financial crisis, but it was a very narrow set of issues and a narrow set of players in terms of the other adjustments that a more integrated European Union was trying to make. And there were vulnerabilities created both on the counterterrorism side and later we find on the migration side by other aspects of the pooling of sovereignty that Europe hadn't yet addressed, Schengen and all of this, that we just weren't invited to be part of, we didn't think was part of what we needed to do. And frankly, very few Americans, I think, understood in that period until later exactly how much Europe itself was changing, how much the pooling of sovereignty would change the way we needed to work together, change Europe's both opportunity for us and its. But, what would I do now? I mean, obviously, the free world is shrinking. The free world is under threat. The greatest concentration of friends and allies is on that continent. If we want to solve, work on issues like China, work on issues like innovation, work on issues like ensuring an internet that favors freedom versus favoring the authoritarians and totalitarians, Europe is our natural partner, as well as tackling the challenges we both have, like income inequality and how to handle migration in a humane way that nonetheless stimulates growth. So this ought to be a moment where we're holding Europe closer, where we're helping Europe to come together around its own solutions to these issues. When Brexit first happened, we were very much involved in 2016 in trying to ensure that the channel didn't boil and that the sides could come up together. And then we sort of decided it wasn't our business. But by the same token, I also have some criticisms of European leaders themselves, where when we leave the conversation or become, in fact, hostile to the conversation, as we have become now, on trade, on NATO, on defense, I don't see any strong vocal champions for liberalism, democratic values, all the things that made us strong and free and prosperous together. You have Macron talking about multilateralism, but that's a different thing than defending this free, open system, and frankly, standing up to some of the rhetoric coming from this side of the world, but also reminding Europeans that they live the way they do because we all invested in this system for 70 years. I want to see some European voices pick up the mantle if we are going to be as we are now.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, this interview that the French President Emmanuel Macron gave this week, in which he not only talked of multilateralism, as he often does, but actually said that NATO was brain dead, both as a result of challenges to it from the United States, from Donald Trump, but also from within. So first of all, Jim, do you think he's got a point, and do you think that NATO will still exist 5 years from now?
So that interview is very much worth reading. The interview that Macron did in The Economist, just the anger that comes through that entire interview is so palpable. And the brain dead comment, which he makes at the beginning and then again at the end, and at the end he's very clear what he's talking about, which is very angry at the lack of strategic coordination, especially with respect to the issue of Turkey and Syria. He talks about how, the United States, without consulting anybody, went ahead and gave a green light to Turkey, and Turkey said, okay, great, we get to go into northern Syria. And, Turkey is a NATO ally. The United States is a NATO ally. You just see that. You see that anger. And of course, he's been trying to make the case for a greater strategic capability within Europe, but he doesn't really have partners. And I think the problem with this interview is it's not really designed in a way that would help him get partners, because for example, of course, the Germans had to respond immediately with